Welcome to New Possibilities. I speak truth to power without fear. This is my response to Conspiracy Dude's video entitled Why They Created the African American. Only in this modern era of social media would a video like this be necessary. A video response like this. Because anyone who's gone to any kind of school, whether I'm talking about high school or college, they understand the history of slavery in this country. They understand that we were taken from Africa and brought to America in bondage. They understand that. That's not even a debatable point in most quarters based on all the evidence. But here in YouTube land, people accept anything that's put in a video. They accept ridiculous conspiracy theories, despite the fact that these theories have no evidence at all behind them, no evidence backing them up. So I felt the need to do this video to respond to Conspiracy Dude's video. And unlike a lot of people, I'm going to actually provide the sources of all the information that I provide in this video. In the description box of this video, I will have links that will direct you to each one of the sources that I relied upon in doing this video. All right, so let's respond to some of the arguments that Conspiracy Dude makes in his video. One of the first things that he says is that we are not Americans. He says that we are not citizens in this country. And to back up his assertion, he cites the Dred Scott case. And for those of you who don't know, that case basically said that the black man is not a citizen in this country. It basically said that the black man has no rights that a white man is obligated to recognize or respect. That was a decision that was issued by the Supreme Court a long time ago. That decision has been reversed, obviously. Now, there are two ways to reverse a Supreme Court case. It can be done by the Supreme Court itself, by issuing a later decision, or it can be done by an act of Congress. Congress can enact laws to reverse a Supreme Court decision. They can amend the Constitution to do so. And that's what they did here. They adopted and amended the Constitution to include the 13th and 14th Amendment. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment protected our rights. It gave us the right to equal protection under the law. So the 13th Amendment says, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for a crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. Congress shall have the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. And the 14th Amendment says, all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protections of the law. So there you have two constitutional amendments that made African Americans citizens in this country. Now, does that mean that we were not subjected to discrimination or racism? Of course not. Of course not. We all know the history and legacy of discrimination in this country. But that doesn't make us not Americans. That doesn't mean that we are not citizens. We have constitutional rights in this country. We can use the courts to fight against race discrimination because we are citizens in this country. We pay taxes just like anybody else. We have fought in every single one of America's wars. Our blood is in the soil of this country. Our sweat, blood, and tears help build this nation. This country is just as much ours as any other group of people. We have paid for our right to be citizens in this country. And only a fool would voluntarily throw out their citizenship status after our ancestors and our elders fought so hard for us to be full citizens with full rights in this country. So we are Americans. This country is our country just as much as it is in anybody else's country. So the notion that we're not Americans is just contrary to the legal facts and contrary to the historical facts. We pay taxes, we receive benefits of citizenship in this country, and we are full citizens in this country. The legal facts are clear, the historical facts are clear. So I'm going to move on to some of the other assertions that he made in this video. And in a nutshell, he basically said, well, we are not Africans. We did not come from Africa. He asserts that we are indigenous people, that we are natives to this country. He's essentially saying that we're Native Americans, that we are the so-called Indians. Now, before I go on to rebut that argument, I'll just say this. The self-hatred that our people experience is so deep that we would rather be anything other than African. We would rather claim anything other than African. You have these cults that teach this nonsense that we are Native Americans. You have people that would rather be Native Americans than African. You have people that would rather call themselves Hebrews than Africans. You have people who would rather call themselves Moors than Africans. You have people that would rather call themselves Asians or Asiatic than African. You have people who will identify with some Arabs more so than they will identify with their own African brothers and sisters. Because the psychosis runs deep, the self-hatred runs deep. For so long, we have been taught that Africa is the dark continent. We've been taught that Africa has not contributed anything to human civilization. So when people have been so thoroughly indoctrinated with this nonsense, with the lie that Africa is nothing, that Africa is a place of barbarism, then their natural instinct is to disidentify with Africa, to disassociate from Africa, to try to cut the ties between themselves and Africa. And that's essentially what this brother conspiracy dude has done in his ridiculous video. He's cut the ties between black people in America and our African brothers and sisters on the continent. And I also think that there's another reason why somebody would want to deny the Middle Passage just because of the horrific history of the Middle Passage. I think that some of us, we want to suppress that historical trauma that our ancestors experienced. That's part of the reason why people want to deny that we came from Africa, that there was a Middle Passage. And I just want to say this. I understand, that his intent may be different from those who deny the Holocaust. But the bottom line is this. The people who deny the slave trade and the Middle Passage, they are no different from those racist hate mongers who deny the existence of the Holocaust. In fact, they are worse than those people. Because the Holocaust took place over a few years. The Middle Passage, the Transatlantic slave trade took place for hundreds of years. The scope of the tragedy is far greater. Millions of African people died during the Middle Passage. And to deny that is to do a disservice to our ancestors, to do a disservice to all those people who were thrown overboard and devoured by sharks. It does a disservice to them. It does a disservice to those who were stripped away from their families and their loved ones, who were stripped away from their cultural identity. So that's just the backdrop. I just wanted to get that out of the way before I went ahead and rebutted Conspiracy Dude's arguments. So in order to accept the Conspiracy Dude's assertions, you have to ignore so much evidence. There's countless evidence that we come from Africa. And I'll start out with the slave narratives. You have narratives of people who were actually captured and kidnapped from Africa and brought to America. Some of them have told their stories. So that history is documented in those slave narratives. That history is also documented in the slave uprisings, the slave ship uprisings that took place. And I'll show you screenshots from an article that cites 5 examples of slave ship uprisings. Those uprisings document the fact that we were brought from Africa to the Americas. Many of us are familiar with the Amistad uprising. We know about that. But this article cites 5 other slave ship uprisings that many of us need to become familiar with. The fact that these uprisings occurred, again, provide proof that there was a Middle Passage, that we were brought from Africa to the Americas. Not only that, there are actual slave ship manifests that list the slaves that were taken from Africa and brought to America. They have a list that documents these trips from Africa to the Americas, that document the Middle Passage. You have slave ship manifests from South Carolina, Louisiana, and other places. So that's another example of how you have evidence that this slave trade took place. Evidence of the transatlantic slave trade. Also, an actual slave ship was recovered off the coast of South Africa. That's more proof of the slave trade. And from what I understand, that slave ship is being recovered and it's going to be on display at the National Museum of African American History. And also there's another slave ship. They have recovered artifacts from another slave ship. And I'll post information about that ship as well, so that you can read about that. Artifacts have been recovered from these slave ships. And I just want to go back to the slave narrative. So you have narratives from people who were actually kidnapped, and then you also have narratives from people who actually participated in the slave trade. You have diagrams drawn of slave ships. These diagrams were literally drawn showing the construction of the slave ship. And I'm not talking about some modern diagrams that were recently done. These diagrams were done at the time when slavery was taking place. You have the Brooks ship diagram, the famous diagram that shows how bodies were situated or organized within these slave ships. Not only do you have ships, slave ship manifests, slave narratives, but you also have castles in Africa, slave castles in Goree Island, in Ghana, and other places of Africa that are living monuments to the horror of slavery. We've all seen the pictures of the door of no return. When Africans would go through that door, they would never return to Africa again. So you have to ignore all these things in order to believe this conspiracy dude. Also, there are many laws that were enacted to govern the slave trade, that were enacted to govern the transatlantic slave trade. Those laws prove the existence of that slave trade. They wouldn't enact such laws if they weren't necessary. Laws that governed the slave trade, they wouldn't have enacted laws banning, at one point, the shipping of slaves from Africa to America if there was no such slave trade. So this guy, conspiracy dude, is exaggerating. He's basing his video on half-truths and false presentation. He showed pictures of Africans and African Americans to try to compare the two, to say that they're two completely different people. In response to that, I'll just say this. Many of the pictures that he showed had photographs of Africans from places where most African Americans do not come from. He had pictures of Africans from Sudan and other places, when we all know that most Africans in America come from the west coast of Africa. But yet he has pictures of Africans from different regions of Africa outside of the west coast of Africa. And he uses those to say, well, you're not Africans. So that's, part of the false presentation that he presents. Also, you can take pictures of anyone. You can measure up pictures to make people look similar or dissimilar. That's easy to do. That proves absolutely nothing. If we look at the hair texture of African Americans, we'll see that we have similar hair textures to our brothers and sisters on the continent. Our hair is kinky just like our brothers and sisters on the continent. We see that many of us have dark complexions just like our brothers and sisters on the African continent. And also, it's worth noting that Africans have varying complexions. You have lighter Africans, you have brown-skinned Africans, and you have darker-skinned Africans. And we, in many ways, resemble our brothers and sisters on the continent. We have the same wide noses, the same full lips, and many other similar features. If you look at just pictures of African heads of state from the west coast of Africa, you can see obvious physical similarities between them and us. So it's just ridiculous for him to present this false notion that we are not Africans. Of course, many of us in America, we uh, have different DNA in us as well, because of interracial relationships and because of, frankly, the history of the slave master raping slaves. So we have the slave master's blood within us as well. So that's why you'll see some variation in the way African Americans look, the variation in our skin colors and in our hair texture and even our eye color as well. Just because of that legacy of uh, intermingling and outright rape. Now, I'm going to conclude on this last note in this video, and that's this. Many African Americans have been tested. They've had their DNA tested to find out their origins. And many African American celebrities, their test results confirm many of the things that I've already discussed. Many of these celebrities have DNA that ties them to places like Senegal and Sierra Leone and other West African countries. So that confirms that we are in fact African people. So those are just some of my comments on this issue. I may do a follow-up video with more information based on the interests and the comments that I receive. So please rate, comment, and subscribe. Peace. And before I go, there are two other issues that I want to address very quickly. The first one is Conspiracy Dude's assertion that Africa was named after a white man. And if I'm not mistaken, he says that Africa was named after Scipio Africanus. And as noted, historian Ranoko Rashidi points out, the name Scipio Africanus implies conqueror of Africa. And as he says, in this Facebook post, that means that the name Africa was already in place before Scipio conquered a portion of Africa. Also, he points out how people try to say that Africa is named after Leo Africanus. And he points out that that name simply means Leo the African. And again, that means the word Africa and African were already in existence before both of these historical figures emerged on the scene. So that's my, first response, dealing with that particular issue. The next issue that Conspiracy Dude brings up is this. He raises the question about African culture. He says, well, if you're African, where's your original language? Where's your original religions? Where's your original culture? Etc., etc. Anybody with any basic understanding of the slave trade, they understand that there was a systematic effort to wipe out African culture and customs. The slave master did everything that he could to try to eradicate or get rid of our cultural traditions, our customs, our way of life, our religions. He made a systematic effort to do so. So that's why the obvious connections are difficult for some people to see. But despite all the efforts that the white man made to obliterate our cultural identity, there are still distinct differences between African people and the larger American society. We have still retained aspects of our culture. You can even see it in how we worship in these Christian churches. We took a Christian religion and we incorporated many of our traditional customs. If you compare some religious ceremonies at Christian churches in terms of people getting the so called Holy Ghost and all that kind of stuff, or people speaking in tongues and all those things, you will see clear and obvious parallels to traditional African faiths. And in some parts of America, like in Louisiana, in other parts of the Americas, like in Brazil and Cuba and Haiti, you see examples of African people still practicing traditional African religions. You see our African culture in our foods that we eat, the way we prepare our foods. You see it in the way we change the language that was given to us. And we have created our own languages, so called Ebonics in America, patois in the Caribbean, etc. So, despite all these efforts to get rid of our culture is still here. You can see it in the dance patterns of African people. So, even though we're not able to identify which particular tribes we're from, we have a general sense that we come from the west coast of Africa. Um, so, again, those are the answers to those questions that Conspiracy Dude raised with respect to culture, religion, and language.